Mr. President.
The Senator from Colorado.
Is the Senate in a quorum call, Mr. President?
We are not.
We're not. Thank you, Mr. President. I ask the motion to reconsider with respect to the Reichelman nomination be considered, made, and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have two requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and the minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of the following nominations en bloc: calendars number 46 through number 52, number 82 through number 107, number 110 through 113, number 130 through 139, 180 through 205, number 224 through 234, number 236 through number 246, that the nominations be confirmed en bloc, the motions be considered to be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order to any of the nominations, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
The Senator from Alabama.
reserving the right to object, and I object.
Objection was heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is now the sixth time that I've been on this floor asking for unanimous consent so that the United States Senate can do its job to ratify, to approve the nominations of flag officers' promotions at the Department of Defense. That is something that we have done as a matter of course in the U.S. Senate for the last 230 years. No senator in the history of the United States has ever prevented the Senate from proceeding with these nominations of flag officers. I certainly don't have to tell the presiding officer how important these promotions are, how critical they are. And observer after observer after observer has said that that it's in the national security interest of the United States, not surprisingly, for this Senate to confirm these promotions, to ratify these promotions. We're compromising our national security when one senator out of the whole 100 people decides that they're going to do something that no senator has ever done in the history of the United States. No senator has ever put a blanket hold on the promotions of flag officers. And there's a good reason for that, because if people were willing to play politics with that, they're playing politics with our national security. If they're willing to play politics with that, they're playing politics with the expectations of people who have spent an entire career defending the national security of this country, serving the public, serving in the Department of Defense, and who now have been promoted to a position of trust and responsibility. By the way, this doesn't just affect those people that are getting that promotion. It also affects the people that are below them that can't get the promotion that now is no longer vacant because they're stuck in the job that they're in. And I'm shocked that somebody here would do this and pretend that this is just common, this is the Senate, this is the way the Senate functions, this is the way the Senate, as my colleague from Alabama has said, just does its business. This is not how the Senate ever does its business. This is not how the Department of Defense does its business. And it's particularly, I think, should be particularly grieving to the American people because of the reasons the senator from Alabama is doing what he's doing. Mr. President, tonight we're here on basically the one-year anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade in the Dobbs decision. If you told me when I was in law school that a majority of the Supreme Court would join a majority opinion by Justice Alito that would say that if it wasn't a right or a freedom in 1868, it's not a freedom today, if you told me that was the basis on which they were going to strip a fundamental freedom from the American people, I would have said that will never happen. It's never going to happen. That is what has happened. And that is the result of a 50-year crusade to overturn a woman's right to choose in the United States of America. It's the first time since Reconstruction that we have given up a fundamental right here. It's the first time since Reconstruction we've been stripped of our fundamental right, that our freedoms have been diminished, that they have grown smaller. In the hands of a 50-year campaign that was waged to put 4 people on the Supreme Court, a majority on the Supreme Court, who subscribe to the best named doctrine I've ever heard named in American political history, or anybody's political history, and that is the doctrine of originalism, a doctrine that was dressed up to create a scenario or a legal set of arguments that somehow there were a group of people in this society with such mystical powers that they were capable, unlike anybody else in America, they would be capable of divining the original intent of the Founding Fathers. Putting aside the fact tonight that everybody in this chamber who studied the Constitution even for 10 minutes knows the founders had fundamental disagreements about themselves, and that the Constitution itself was a product of those fundamental differences. Not their fundamental consensus, but the fundamental differences. There was consensus on some issues. There was compromise on other issues. But I dwell on that for a moment just to say to, especially to people around here, maybe the age of the pages in the Senate, that you shouldn't give this theory of legal interpretation any great weight just because they dressed it up and called it something called originalism. Or they said somehow they could divine what the Founding Fathers said. And what fundamentally it came down to in the case of the Supreme Court was that because abortion wasn't a freedom, as they said in 1868, a country where women didn't even have the right to vote in the United States yet, that it was not going to be a freedom today. And they stripped the American people of this freedom. And there were people on this floor, the people, in the other party, who spent 50 years trying to create a Supreme Court like this, basically since Ronald Reagan was our president. I think Ronald Reagan would be shocked by the extreme nature of the opinion that was rendered by Justice Alito, but who knows? What we do know is this has been a 50-year campaign that's been waged. And the second that the Supreme Court did what they'd been shooting for the last 50 years, what they started to say was, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. This is just reverting to states' rights. This fundamental constitutional right, this fundamental constitutional freedom, it's just reverting to the states. What's happened since then, Mr. President? 20 states have banned abortion since that decision was made, or restricted access. 9 of those states have no exceptions for rape or incest, like the state of Alabama, I think, which has an exception for the life of the mother. So there is a lot to worry about in this decision. There's a lot to worry about for our men and women in uniform. Before Dobbs, women in the military had at least some assurance that wherever the Pentagon sent them, they'd have minimal access to reproductive care, a protected constitutional right, a protected freedom. That is no longer the case. One of the very first calls I got, Mr. President, after Dobbs was decided was from a woman that I know in Colorado who was an Air Force officer. She was a pilot. She told me her personal story, and then she said, I don't understand how they could possibly have made the decision that they made, because this is a fundamental readiness issue. Well, they didn't have to deal with that. They didn't have to deal with that fundamental issue of readiness. They didn't have to deal with these fundamental remedies or the fundamental fact of how people every single day would be dealing with the loss of this right or the loss of this freedom, because nothing in their interpretive doctrine requires them to do that. It only requires them to ask, was it a freedom in 1868? Not a freedom today. And in response to this shocking development, and it is shocking, you know, if you are the age of the pages that are here, if you're my daughter's age, my oldest daughter is 23 years old, you're wondering how it is possible. We were having this conversation the other day. We were driving by a billboard in Colorado, you know, advertising some stuff in Colorado. Amazing thing that we could be, on the one hand, legalizing marijuana in this country, and on the other hand, banning abortion. If you told me that when I was a teenager in America, I would have said, what are you smoking? That's impossible. That's impossible. And that's where we are. What the Supreme Court did in this case is fundamentally unpopular with the American people. The American people are angry that this has happened. It didn't happen by accident. This is a war that has been waged on a woman's right to choose. It's a war that has been waged for that doctrine of originalism. And a lot of people and a lot of institutions in America are having to make adjustments in the wake of this shocking development. And the Pentagon is one of those places. And in the wake of the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade, the Pentagon extended two policies that already exist for service members if a medical procedure is not available near their duty station. One was a travel allowance. If you can't get that knee operated on close to your duty station, we're going to pay you to travel. That is what the rules say today. By the way, that's not a law that Congress passed. That is the DOD making regulations, which is how this works, to ensure that the people serving our country are able to get the medical care that they need. So we say, you know what, you're going to have a travel allowance. And because you have to travel to do this, we're going to give you paid leave to do that, to go get that knee surgery. And what the DOD said in the wake of the Dobbs decision reversing Roe versus Wade is that if you are doing that because you've made a decision to seek reproductive health care, you've made a decision to have an abortion, we're going to apply the same rules to you that we apply for these other surgeries. We're not going to treat you differently. We're going to treat you exactly the same. That's what we're going to do. And if you need to travel because it's not available, you can do it. So if you live in a state like Alabama, where my colleague who is blocking every single appointment or promotion in the DOD where he lives, where it is, you know, you can, if you're a doctor and you perform an abortion, you can go to jail for 99 years. If you're living in a state like Alabama where abortion is banned, and there are very limited exceptions, if any exceptions, that you can go somewhere else to do it, or that the DOD will actually pay for you to go. And the DOD will give you paid leave, and that's true whether you're seeking women's reproductive health care, or you're going for knee surgery. But knee surgery isn't banned in 20 states in this country. And there was one other thing that the Department of Defense said, which was they said, you know what? In the case of a pregnancy, you can tell your commanding officer, you can tell your command 20 weeks after you've learned of your pregnancy. You don't have to tell people right away because things might happen in the early stages of a pregnancy, or you might make decisions to have an abortion in that time. This was an attempt by DOD to harmonize the rules at DOD for health care with the changes at the Supreme Court. It would be difficult, in my mind at least, to imagine a more modest set of changes to the rules by DOD. I've thought about it. What could be more modest than saying, okay, if we're going to pay people that are getting knee surgery or other, or pay them paid leave, then we're going to do this for everybody else, for women who need reproductive health care. If we're going to pay people to travel for these other things, then we're going to let people travel. I would think that most people, who have disagreements about abortion in this country might say, well, that is fair. People have the right to be able to make this decision on their own, or they should have the right to make this decision on their own. And we shouldn't discriminate against people just because we might have a disagreement about abortion. One thing this set of rules does not do in any shape or form is pay for an abortion. And the senator from Alabama has almost admitted as much on this floor. He said it's sort of tantamount to that. It's sort of this. And Senator Lee from Utah was sort of saying that it's sort of, but they know that it's not. That's not what the rules do. That's a debate that we're going to need to have here. But that is not what's happening here. What's happening here is the rules as I stated it. And the senator from Alabama, Mr. President, was so enraged by this, so infuriated by this, so angered by this, that he's now put a blanket hold on 249 military promotions to unwind those rules, to change those rules, to force the DOD to retreat, and the DOD to say, okay, from here on out, here's what we're going to do. We will pay for your travel for every single operation that you can't get at your duty station, except if you're a woman who's seeking reproductive health care. If you're a woman who's going to have an abortion, we are going to discriminate against you. We're going to treat you differently than everybody else for every other purpose. And we are going to give you paid leave because we understand that it's inconvenient to have to go somewhere else from your duty station. By the way, you haven't asked to be at that duty station. We're going to give you paid leave, except if you are going because of reproductive health care, in which case we're going to discriminate against women and say, uniquely, you do not get paid leave. And I guess you have to inform your commanding officer, or somebody does, that you're pregnant sooner than the 20 months. That's the world that the senator from Alabama is trying to pursue here on this floor by holding every single military promotion, every flag officer promotion in the United States of America when Putin is invading Ukraine and China is sailing their shiny new navy all over the South China Sea. And I know he knows it. He can't think it's a good idea. I know he's come out here and said, oh, don't worry about it. There are acting people that are doing those jobs. Don't worry about it. The generals don't actually make decisions. It's the enlisted people that are doing all the work. Don't worry about it. Somehow this is going to help with the recruiting quagmire that he has pointed out. I don't think, by the way, it's going to help with the recruiting quagmire that he's talked about out here, that women that are thinking about joining the military are going to know that their lives are in the hands of politicians in Washington, D.C. Their very lives are in their hand. Their destiny is in their hand. A DOD can send them to a place where abortion is banned and doctors go to jail for 99 years if they perform an abortion, or they might be lucky enough to serve in a place like Colorado where we've codified Roe versus Wade already. We're the first state in America to do it. And I don't have to tell the presiding officer who, by the way, served and has been on the Armed Services Committee, how important these jobs are we're talking about. The next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Air Force General C.Q. Brown. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The chief of the National Security Agency. The next military representative to NATO. You think that's an important job? Soon, this hold is going to include the next commandant of the Marine Corps, the Army Chief of Staff, the Chief of Naval Operations, putting our national security at risk. Mr. President, I'd ask that at the outset of tonight's proceedings, I asked if we could have unanimous consent on a number of these promotions, and I would like to put the names and the ranks and positions into the record, please.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Former Defense Secretary Gates, who, by the way, for those who don't know, was appointed by George W. Bush, said that the senator from Alabama has made the military, quote unquote, a pawn. That's a guy who served in a Republican administration. We've had secretaries of defense from both sides of the aisle who said that the senator from Alabama is hurting our national defense, he's hurting our national security, he's playing politics with our Department of Defense. And what is his justification again? Well, it's no different than what I already said. He uses different words. He says that the DOD has made the Department of Defense, by making these rules, into an abortion travel agency. That's his word, abortion travel agency. Well, that's not true. We've already talked about the travel allowance and the absence without leave and the more time to notify. I'm sure there are some people, a handful of people in America, who couldn't see the wisdom in that, who would disagree with that. But I'll bet you the vast majority of people in this country, including people who have a different view on a woman's right to choose than I have, would say that women ought to have the right in the Department of Defense to get travel paid for just like anybody else, and to get paid leave, and to be able to have 20 weeks to be able to tell their commanding officer that they're pregnant. This is an effort to punish women who are seeking reproductive health care and forcing them, for reasons I don't understand, to tell their commanding officers the minute that they're pregnant. This is reminiscent to me of the states after the court overturned Roe versus Wade, that started to look at bills to try to prevent women from traveling from states that had banned abortion to states that had, made abortion legal. It's kind of a shocking place for us to be in, to hear people party, embrace freedom and talk about freedom all the time, and still live in a place where we're talking about trying to ban Americans from traveling from one state to another, or not allowing the Department of Defense to pay money or to use paid leave for women's reproductive health care the way they do for anything else. I mean, I believe strongly in a woman's right to choose, and I believe it should be a decision that's made between a woman and her doctor. Most Americans agree with that. I know that there's profound moral disagreement on this question, and I respect that. But I think it's fair to say that the senator from Alabama's position on this, to not allow paid leave, to not allow paid travel, to not allow women to get 20 weeks before they have to tell their commanding officers that they're pregnant, the vast majority of Americans, I think, would agree that those rules are appropriate. By the way, one of the other reasons the senator from Alabama has objected to this is that, he says that the Senate, if the Senate wanted those rules, it should have passed those rules. Well, the Senate doesn't write rules like that. We didn't pass the rules that exist today that pay for people to be able to go get surgery or get paid leave in the military. Those are rules that the Department of Defense makes, having been delegated that authority by the Congress. But man, he's in a totally different place on this. He says that he's going to keep his hold until the Pentagon follows the law or Congress changes the law. That's the way we do it here in the Senate. That's a reference to what I was just talking about in terms of the rules. And by the way, this is not how we do this in the Senate. Just not. It's not. And the evidence is that no one in the history of this body has ever done this, ever, in the history of the country. Nobody's done this. Nobody's done it. And I would say that not only has nobody done it and taken a political position that's so far outside the mainstream of conventional American political thought. I think the American people should be asking their senators where they stand on this. There are only 100 people here. It's not hard to find our telephone numbers or our addresses. Should be asking them, do you agree? Do you agree that we should be holding up every single flag officer's promotion because one senator thinks that we shouldn't have paid leave or paid travel for women that need reproductive health care? He says he's going to relent only when that's true. He's only going to relent when there is a DOD policy that pays for every other surgery that somebody could get, that has paid family leave for any other procedure that you could get, but bans that for abortion. That is an extreme position. That is an extreme position. It's an extreme position to say that we're going to not allow people to have 20 weeks to make this decision. There are no exceptions in Alabama for rape or incest. That may be part of the reason why he has the perspective he does. It is a state where if you're a doctor and you perform an abortion, you could go to jail for 99 years. But that's not what the majority of Americans believe on this issue. It's not. It's not. I don't even think the majority of Alabamans believe that. But the majority of Americans certainly don't. The majority of Americans believe in a woman's right to choose. The majority of Americans believe that these questions are best decided by a woman, between a woman and her doctor, or her family and her faith, if she has one. And that is what my state believes, Mr. President. We were the first state to decriminalize abortion before Roe was even decided, and we're the first state to codify a woman's right to choose. That is, I think, what freedom actually looks like, Mr. President. Our state in Colorado is the first state to codify Roe since the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. And other folks were saying you don't need to worry about the states. Now, one of the largest states in America a large state where something like 65% of the people support a woman's right to choose, the governor of that state, the state of Florida, has banned abortion after 6 weeks. And he signed that law at 11 o'clock at night when nobody would be around to see the way he was trampling on the freedom of his constituents. Most Americans, if they knew this debate was happening, would be shocked, I think, to hear that what we're trying to do here is prevent women from getting paid leave, that we're trying to prevent women from having paid travel, that we're trying to prevent women from having 20 weeks to tell their commanding officer. That is what the senator from Alabama is saying. That until that happens, until we're preventing women from those things, until we're discriminating against women that are seeking reproductive health care, that he's going to continue to hold all these nominations forever? I don't know how anybody can take that position and say that they stand for freedom. But that is the position that the senator from Alabama has taken. And I hope he will reconsider what he's doing because of the damage that it's causing our national security. At a moment when, as I said, Putin has invaded Ukraine and China is pressing its advantages in various places around the world, we need the senator to lift these holds. And I'm going to keep coming to the floor until he does. Thank you, Mr. President. I'll yield the floor. I know it's late. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
The senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I understand there's a bill at the desk and I ask for its first reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
H.R. 277, an act to amend Chapter 8 of